Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. How good am I? 2 videos in 1 month, we're doing good. So for those of you who may not realize, this Saturday is actually genealogy day, which makes it a perfect day to continue researching your family tree, maybe start researching your family tree, who knows. For those of you who may not realize, but I feel like a lot of you probably do, particularly if you've followed me for a while now, you will know that I have been researching my family tree for what feels like forever. And I've shared a lot of genealogy related content, both here on this channel and across all my social media. In fact, I have a whole podcast called Uncovering Family History dedicated to genealogy. I will say it's been a while since my last episode, but it's coming together. It takes a while. These things take a while, okay? So before I even dive into this video, I'm going to leave a bunch of links below. If you're interested in family history, if you're interested in genealogy, please go check them out and see all of the other content that I've produced over the years. I'm very proud of it. Definitely check it out. But today I wanted to do a little bit of a sort of a family history 101 kind of thing, in particular focusing on some records that you definitely need to be searching before you dive into everything else, because it's definitely overwhelming researching your family tree. There are so many records and databases and indexes that are available to search that if you don't really know what you're doing or are a little bit unsure of what you're doing, it can be really easy to feel really overwhelmed and wondering where to start. And maybe you end up falling down a rabbit hole and chasing things that you don't need to be chasing, or finding records for someone who isn't actually even your ancestor but they share the same name as your ancestor, which can be a little bit frustrating. So to kind of eliminate some of that overwhelming feeling and to make sure that we are searching in the places that are correct and that are for our ancestors, I think it's really important to start with the basics and kind of cover those first, and cover the records I'm about to share with you first, because once you do that, you'll not only have fleshed out your ancestors' stories a little bit more, sometimes quite a lot depending on what records you're able to find and the type of person they are, you will then have enough information and context in order to know what records to look for next, and also whether they actually relate to your ancestor, not just someone who shares the same name as them. So this video definitely targeted towards people who are a little bit newer to the family history scene, but a really good refresher for those who have been around the block a couple of times but maybe just need a bit of revitalizing. So let's go. So number one, the basics, and probably one of the most important places to start is births, deaths, and marriages, and by extension, christenings, baptisms, and burials. So once you have any sort of basic information in your family tree, it's obviously really good to be able to confirm that the information you have is actually correct, and the best way to do that is through births, deaths, and marriages. It will not only confirm that the dates are correct, but will also confirm parents' names, spouses' names, even children's names, and just help you flesh the tree out a little bit. As I said, confirm those people, and just to then have that context of okay, this person is definitely related to this person, therefore this other record is about them. Where you go searching for births, deaths, and marriages is obviously going to depend on where you are in the world. Here in Australia, each state has their own birth, deaths, and marriages registry, and I'm pretty sure all of the states, I don't have experience with every single state. I've only delved into New South Wales and Victoria because that's where my family hail from. All states have a family history section of the website that allows you to search historical records and search the historical index, and then turn around and order a historical document, which is actually a cheaper and easier process than doing it I suppose official way of having to confirm how you connected to that person and pay a lot more to get a certificate reissued. There is one slight setback, and I think that's probably going to be the same the world over, and that is privacy restriction. For example, in Victoria, births can only be accessed after 100 years, deaths 30 years, and marriages 60 years. And I think New South Wales have a slight different date range, and then I'm pretty sure all other states are probably very similar within that ballpark, and that's fair enough. So obviously you're not going to be able to find the records for ancestors more closely linked to you, but it's going to be really good for those ancestors further back. And the really cool thing is, depending on what information is available in the index online, you might not necessarily have to turn around and get a historical certificate. I personally think it's a really good idea to get the certificates of those directly related to you. So, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, very much direct line stuff. It's really good to have, but for all of those ancillary, that's not even the word I'm thinking of, all of the branching out relatives and ancestors, you probably don't need to be spending money on to get their certificates unless there is something that you're really trying to find and you really want to see what is actually on the certificate. But by all means, obviously go ahead and do that, but obviously it's going to be quite an expensive task. So if you just have the main focus being on your direct line, and then you can kind of figure out what you want to do with everyone else. But I found that there is a lot of information available just on the indexes that you don't really need to get the certificates. The UK, I find, tends to lean very much more towards baptisms and christenings, which are just as helpful and still provide you the information of like when they were baptized and who the parents are. The only problem I find with UK records, it's obviously really broken down into parish records, which you've got to like know the parish that they were in. It can be a little bit complicated, but once you sort of get into the records, it can be quite easy. Again, I'm not quite sure what records are accessible for everywhere else in the world. I can only talk about the records that I'm familiar with. I'm most familiar with Australian records and kind of with UK records, but not really, because I haven't yet gone back to the UK that much. I've currently my research, because I love the Australian records and how easy they are to utilize, I've mainly focused on my Australian ancestors and kind of don't do too much for when they lived in the UK, but I'm slowly getting there. So once you can sort of confirm the lifespan of your ancestors, then it's really easy to kind of go in to other records and kind of fill in those gaps between those life events. And the next thing to search is the census and for Australia, the electoral rolls. So obviously we are very well aware that the census, particularly in the UK and the US, and I think Ireland, maybe Scotland, I'm not entirely sure, and I don't really know where else in the world, the census was done every 10 years, and it is a really good way to track family in terms of where they were living, makeup of their household, their ages, what their occupations were, and if there was anyone else living in the house, whether there was extended family members living with them, whether they had lodgers or servants. It is a really good way to have a glimpse into their lives every 10 years. And by then knowing where they were living at certain points in their lives, you can better determine what type of resources, what type of sources to look at next, and be able to confirm that an address or a location of a source matches where your ancestor was at that time. Now in Australia, we don't have the luxury of the census. I mean, we do a census every 4 years, but we don't actually have access to historical census records. We can access the data, but not the specific records. I think there are only like 2 or 3 really historical census records that we can access on like Ancestry. But for us, our census is actually the Australian electoral roll, and that predominantly starts at 1930 and goes through to 1980. There are a few earlier electoral rolls that are available, but the majority of them, but the bulk of it is 1930 to 1980. The electoral roll came out and was updated every 2 to 4 years. Depends. The 1930s, I think there is an electoral roll for nearly every single year in the 1930s. It's a bit ridiculous. Because the electoral roll was more frequent, it means it's actually really easy to track movement of your ancestors. Because take the census, for example, they're 10 years apart. They obviously might have moved since the last census, but they could have moved like 3 or 4 times in those 10 years that you're not really going to know about, because you've only got their residence information for those 2 specific dates and 2 specific points in time. Whereas for the electoral roll, you can literally trace when they move every couple of years kind of thing. Obviously, not everyone's moving every couple of years. Some people are not even moving at all for the entirety of the available electoral roll records. But if they are moving a lot, you can track it. So the electoral rolls still contain the information of their name, their address and their occupation, but it is lacking in some respects. It doesn't have their ages. It also only contains people who are over the age of, I think it was initially 21 and then it dropped back to 18, so children are not included on the electoral roll. It also goes alphabetically by surname, not by household and address. So if you have someone in that household who are legally recognized as adults but don't share the same surname, whether that be an extended family member, a lodger, a servant, whatever, they're not going to be listed with where your ancestors are, because they're going to be listed under their surname, still their address, but under their surname. So you might not even know or realize that there are other people living in the house. So it does have its faults, but it is the best that we've got, and it is honestly better than nothing. And it is really interesting to be able to track those movements more frequently. Record number 3 is military records. I guarantee that pretty much all of us have at least one ancestor in our family tree who served in predominantly a 20th century conflict. So World War I, II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and peacekeeping operations. And also I'll backtrack a little bit, and even the Boer War. And then also in different locations around the world, there are more geographical conflicts. Like in the US, there's like the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, and things like that, but predominantly big 20th century worldwide conflicts. And military records are seriously so interesting. You might sort of be thinking like, military records, that's just going to contain like a basic enlistment form and then just, you know, track the movements of their military career and where they were stationed, which obviously are interesting, but military records can actually tell you so much more about the person and their family. So yes, you do have the enlistment sheet, which lists where they're living, how old they are, maybe even their birthday, who they're next of kin with, so who their next of kin is, which might be a spouse or a parent. They list what their most recent occupation was, maybe even where they worked. One of my favorite pages in the war files is the medical examination information. You get to find out their hair color, eye color, their height, their weight, if they had any like very distinguishing features, like if they had scars or like beauty marks or something. I've noticed in World War II files for my grandfather, it lists not only his wife's name, but also the children he had at that point. And he had a child, he enlisted in World War II in 42. He had a child in 43, so you can tell that she was written in a different pen. She was actually written in pencil, I think. So you can tell like she was written into this file after she was born during his service. There's just so much in war files that it's so interesting to discover. It's not just war stuff. And again, the war service stuff is also really interesting, but sometimes it can be like a little bit hard to get into initially, trying to like understand what these records are saying. In Australia, we are very fortunate that all World War I and pretty much nearly all World War II records are on the National Archives, with the aim that all World War II records will be digitized on the National Archives this year. And then obviously we can also access Korea and Vietnam, but a lot of the times we're going to have to pay for them to be digitized, but that's fine. And then we also have the Australian War Memorial, the Department of Veteran Affairs. There's a few other websites. I'll link to some stuff below if you're interested. I've found also that Canada and New Zealand have relatively easy archives to search, and that a lot of things are available for free as well, which I appreciate, because let's face it, genealogy can get kind of expensive after a while when you're trying to access all these records. The UK I've had a little bit more trouble with, because aside from the fact that not everything is digitized yet, and is not as easily searchable online, like a lot of things you literally have to go to the archives. Bit impossible for me here in Australia, but it's also really important to remember that for the UK, a lot of war records were destroyed in the Blitz, and that is made explicit that there are war records missing, which is a massive shame, but that's the way of the world apparently. And I have no experience of searching US records, but yeah, I just start with your National Archives and you'll be really surprised at what you can find and what is pertained in those war records. Number 4 is honestly my favorite thing to search, and that is newspaper articles, because you will be surprised at just how much random stuff was recorded in newspapers back in the day. And sort of how much stuff is reported in newspapers that you cannot find in any other record database ever. you can really bring your ancestors to life with even the shortest little snippet of newspaper article. So obviously if you have an ancestor who is involved in something a little bit scandalous, maybe criminal, you're gonna probably find a lot of articles about that, and there's probably gonna be some sort of like paper trail in the courts and in the jail records as well that you'll be able to then search, because you have a really good outline of what went down because of the newspaper articles. It's really good if you can find really lengthy and chunky obituaries that essentially just give all of the life details. A lot of the times there are really good little marriage articles that give a nice little rundown, either in real depth about what the wedding was like what the bride was wearing and the bridesmaids, or even just talking about like who was part of the wedding party, and a lot of the time that's family members, so boom, you've got some more names there. But my favorites though are in what a lot of newspapers called about people, and I found it predominantly to be something in like more rural and regional newspapers as opposed to city newspapers. And I don't know if it's just an Australian thing or if it's something that was done elsewhere, but these like about people columns were essentially like gossip columns. Like, yes, they gave like some birth, death, marriage, engagement, baptism, like little notices, but they also gave some of the most mundane updates about people. Like, I've literally got a million articles, a million like little clippings of like, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Smith went on holiday to the city. Mr. and Mrs. Smith were visited by, you know, his sister, or they went holidaying with her sister in whatever location. If, like, honestly, if you went anywhere, if you had visitors, if you went to hospital and came back out, you were in the newspaper for that. But it is so insightful historically and looking for your family. I found out that, like, I had found an article of like one of my uncles who was like 14 or 16 or something. He was wood chopping and he cut his foot and got his toe amputated because of it. Some of the most random stuff. And obviously, and then also if you have like ancestors who were into business, who had a business, like you'll probably find like stories and advertising about that. Like, the possibilities of what you can find are endless. In Australia, we are super fortunate to have Trove and so many newspapers digitized and available for free. Obviously there is currently like a funding issue happening, and I hope that by the time the 1st of July rolls around, we've still got access for free to Trove, because it is such an amazing resource. And we are honestly so spoiled, because when you go to other countries and look at their archives, it's not free, or it's more difficult to search. So then the 5th and final source that you definitely need to be looking at can sometimes involve going on excursions, which I like. This is another one of my favorite things to do, and that is burial and cemetery records. So obviously I sort of touched on this when I talked about birth, death and marriages, but this is more about actually like going to those locations, whether in person or virtually, and actually not just seeing that, okay, that person's buried in that cemetery, but actually seeing where they were buried, what was on the headstone, hopefully if there's a headstone there. And there's like a lot of information that what is on the headstone or what isn't on the headstone can actually tell you. You know, obviously you have the name and dates, but you will also come across like spouses' names, maybe parents' names, children's names, maybe even grandchildren's names, or lack thereof sometimes. Maybe it can tell you a little bit, maybe the headstone can tell you a little bit more about the possible living and relationship situation of the person at the time they died. I've worked out from one headstone that a couple had obviously been divorced, because one, they weren't buried anywhere near each other. He was buried in a lawn cemetery and she was like buried with her family off in like the old section of the cemetery. But then I also realized that she was buried with her maiden name. She wasn't mentioned on his headstone, even though he went first. And it made me realize, like, they've gotten divorced. And I managed to then go back and track her movements through the electoral rolls, and I ended up finding the divorce notice in a gazette or a newspaper or something like that, which I was like, granted, I probably would have been able to find that eventually, but it was just how the burial information read that just made something click, that I was like, hang on, I need to like look at what's going on here. I personally love visiting cemeteries in person. If I'm ever going anywhere that is anywhere near where I had family members, I will like look up to see if there's a chance they're buried there, or just take a wild guess and hope they're buried there. And I will go and visit their headstone in person, which is just always a really like nice and sombering thing. I just generally love wandering around cemeteries, whether I'm related to people there or not. And it's also a good opportunity to like get the photos of headstones and have that in your collection. Obviously, we are very fortunate to have the likes of Find a Grave and Billion Graves that have recorded a lot of burials all over the world and included photos of them. But obviously it's really important to remember they are volunteer contributed. So there are going to be cemeteries that don't really have a lot of burials registered for them, or a lot that don't have photos attributed to them. So I think it's really important to, like, obviously in situations where you can't physically go to that cemetery, to utilize the likes of Find a Grave and Billion Graves. But if you can actually go to a cemetery, I think it is well worth going and getting photos. Even if it turns out there are already photos online, at least you've been able to say you've seen it for yourself. And then for the burials that aren't online yet, you can then turn around and add them and help extended members of your family and future generations be able to access that same information. And one thing I will also suggest, if you are doing some cemetery exploring, one, I've got a whole blog post on it if you want to know more, but I think it's also really important that if you are going to a cemetery, definitely check on Find a Grave or Billion Graves if there are any photo requests for that cemetery, so that way while you're there, if you have the time and the ability, just have a bit of a peruse around and see if you can fulfill that photo request for someone, because there's no doubt that you've utilized the photo request feature in order to get a photo of a headstone that you can't physically visit. And I think it's really good that from time to time that we try and repay that, even though it's obviously not repaying the exact same person who got the photo for you. It's just passing all the good karma around. And then even though I've not really had too much experience with it, there are obviously some symbolisms that you'll find on headstones and burials that can allude a lot to someone's life. I think that's very much more sometimes like an American thing, like the symbolisms you find on headstones, and maybe even like a thing from England. I feel like here in Australia we sort of haven't necessarily done it as much, in terms of like, you know, the dove means, like a dove on it means something, or like an angel means this. Obviously the types of like, obviously probably the most prominent symbols we sort of see, and we've sort of seen a lot in the last like 100 years, are like symbolism relating to organizations that people are involved in, including like, war service clubs, like Freemasons and things like that. That's the kind of symbolism we see a lot here in Australia. I could be wrong. I mean, there's probably maybe in like bigger areas where the cemeteries are older, there might be more symbolism and things like that. But yeah, there's a lot to like look into about symbolism surrounding burials, not just like literally what is written on the headstone, but also like what the headstone and the plaque and whatever looks like and what's included on it. So once you have sort of covered those 5 sources and source types, you are going to have fleshed out your ancestor story so much, and it should hopefully give you a really good idea of like what records specifically to look at next. So whether you need to go look for jail and court records, whether you need to look in business directories to find more about your ancestors' business, whether you need to be looking at inquest information, and like whatever other sort of records are out there, school records, and maybe you have a better idea of like, maybe you need to reach out to this, a certain historical society or museum in like the area where they lived, maybe the parish where they lived, the church. It just gives you that little bit more information and a little bit better and clearer idea of where to go next. And then obviously, as I said, you've then got all this information and context surrounding this person, and being able to know that, okay, this record, it pretty much fits my ancestor, so there's a really good chance that it is them. Obviously, you still need to evaluate the source and ensure that it is about your ancestor, but if you've got all this other information, there's a really good chance that they are. Whereas if you had found that same source but not had any other information, and hadn't filled in all of these blanks and given your ancestor this story or context, it can be really difficult to determine whether that is your ancestor or not. As I said at the top of the video, I've done a whole bunch of other genealogy stuff in the past, and so I'll link below to my playlist here on this channel and a page on my blog where I have linked literally every piece of family history content I've ever done, from blog posts to videos to podcast stuff. If you are interested in family history, I definitely also recommend checking out my podcast Uncovering Family History, and all of the connected socials. Between figuring out episodes, I've been posting a lot of stuff on Instagram over on @UncoverFamilyHistory. a lot of fun little family history related like cartoons and memes and fun stuff, but also some like research help and tips and tricks and things like that. I'm quite proud of what I've been able to curate over there. So if you're on Instagram or even on Twitter, I post some of the stuff there as well, then definitely go follow that, because I'm quite happy with all the content I'm creating over there. Even if the podcast, like the podcast aspect of it is like slowly coming together, the other content is really fun. But yeah, lots of stuff to check out if you're interested in family history. I think that's it. If you like this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and I will see you at some point soon with another video at some point. And don't forget, Genealogy Day this Saturday. Make sure you spend it researching your family tree. Bye.